What we're going to do is we're going to look today at a couple of halachas that specifically have to do with food, not of cooking as such, but rather the warming up and the heating and things like that to do with food. But before we do, let's just we're going to learn in the merit of two ill people. Firstly, just in order of age, from oldest to youngest, from Avram David HaKohen Ben Sarah Gittel. He's one of our members, and he's having an op tomorrow to remove a tumor from his stomach. Please God, he should be well. We learn in his merit, and also in the merit of Yisha Aaron Ben Chana, who is a 6-year-old child. It's Laura's nephew. Please God, he should also have a refuah shlema. So we do what we can, and we learn and we daven, and please God, the power of the Torah that we learn and the constant input from the Torah that comes from it should be in their merit and should help them to get the refuah that they need and that they require. Okay.
Amen.
Thank you. Okay. So what I want to do today is actually go into the halachas that I wanted to speak about. I don't have the normal source sheets for various technical reasons, so I'm just going to speak it out, and it's okay because there's an enormous amount of information, and what I'd like to do is really just understand firstly the parameters of basically warming food on Shabbos, and then warming food that comes from the fridge on Shabbos, because there are so many different things that we need to be aware of. And in essence, there are really the three issues. The first one is a doraita issue. The first one is a possible problem from the Torah, and the other two are the Rabbanans. So let's first look at the doraita one, and that's bishul, the actual cooking. Now, again, with the bishul as a malacha is a huge malacha, as one of the primary malachas of Shabbos, because we use it all the time and we have to be careful. Bishul means cooking, and it has different aspects of it. I don't want to discuss the depth of bishul right now. We'll do that separately. I just want to look at really the ideas of warming food on Shabbos as a general rule. So how would one warm food? So if we start off, let's go from the Friday night and move into the Shabbos. So as a general rule, the way what we would want to do on a Shabbos is that before Shabbos comes in, you want to take your food, and you'd want to put it into a place where it can retain its warmth, and then it's great, and Shabbos comes and you eat the warm food and everything's fantastic. However, let's understand that it's not the most simple thing, because if we look at bishul, which is cooking, that includes, now it's not limited to, but it just includes, for example, finishing off the cooking of a food. So for example, let's say you have a challah that's not 100% baked. It's there's still a little bit of doughiness in it. If you would put that into an oven, it would continue to cook. The continuation of cooking seems to be problematic, and that would be a possible issur d'oraita of actually cooking on Shabbos. Heating a cold liquid, even if it was cooked before, is also, so gravy or something like that would also be a problem of bishul. That's what we hold. Then there's this concept of hatmana. Hatmana means insulated. So what that means is that you take a food and you completely surround it on all sides in a manner that preserves the food heat. And that's on a simple level. Now, if you do it before Shabbos, so then hatmana is only problematic if the insulation causes the food to actually become hotter. In other words, it increases the cooking process. But on Shabbos itself, even if it just maintains the food heat, that's a problem. And that's a whole lot of different discussions that we also have to look at. And then there's this concept of chazara, and chazara means returning. So you would take it off the heat use what you needed, and then put it back on the heat. So there are a number of different issues which have to be attended to, and it's very important that we attend to them properly, because if we don't, then we have problematic. Okay, so let's go. One of the things that people speak about when they speak about keeping food warm on Shabbos is this thing called a blech. Now, if you look at the definition of a blech, the way I understand it, a blech is very simply a piece of metal. That's where it comes from, actually. It comes from the Yiddish word. Blech means sheet metal. Okay, so it's a metal sheet used to cover the top burners of the stove. Okay, and sometimes it actually covers the knobs as well. Okay, and the whole point of it is to avoid the cooking on Shabbos. So you don't put it directly onto the stove; you put it onto the blech. I mean, it's unbelievable that there's a book called the Blech Book, the complete and illustrated guide to Shabbos hot plates, right? Which is written by Rabbi Official Jacobs, and that is like a book on blechs. So it's really important, because what he explains that there's certain guidelines in which you can use a blech, and we have to understand the blech, because we'll have to see. Well, we'll get there. So he says, for example, if you're going to put food onto a blech before Shabbos, the food, including the water, if there's water, has to be completely cooked before. The stove, if you're using gas or electric coils, you have to turn them on, obviously. The blech is then placed over this, okay?
We need to hear this.
Or there's a Shabbos hot plate. Now, the Shabbos hot plate is a very, very interesting thing, because there's a lot of conversation around the Shabbos hot plate as to whether it's considered to be a blech, or is it something else? Why is there a difference? Because the blech is on the stove itself, and the Shabbos hot plate is there. And you cook on a stove, but you don't cook on a Shabbos, on a normal hot plate. One of those, I don't know, Sultan hot tray. So that's a completely different animal, according to many. So let's try and just get a little bit of understanding about it. So during Shabbos, okay, obviously you once you've got everything right according to what you're allowed to put on, and you take it off, it's not an issue. But if you want to re-put it on, let's say you took something off your blech, not your hot tray, your blech, because there is a difference. If you took something off your blech, so then you would have to have certain conditions we'll go to if you want to return it in order to maintain the heat. So you can't take off your soup that you've kept on your blech and then just simply take it off and then put it back on willy-nilly. There's certain conditions that we have to go into that. That's the part of the warming that I want to just have a look at that immediately. So the way it works is the following: that if on Shabbos you decide, let's say Friday night, you've got soup for everybody, and you take it off because you have to take it off the heat source in order to serve it. So you would take it off, and then you realize that if you're going to take it off, there are a couple of people that may want some more. So you want to put it back on to keep it warm. How would you do that? And that's a very important part. So if we have a look, and again, we're giving overviews, and there's a lot of stuff to really understand it. According to the Shmir Shabbos Hilchot Shabbat, he gives guidelines, 5 specific guidelines. The first one is that the food has to be fully cooked. So that soup, no issue, all boiled, wonderful, terrific. It's still got to be somewhat hot. It doesn't have to be boiling, but it still has to be somewhat hot, because you can't, if it's not hot, then you can't return it to the fire, because that would reheat it, especially if it's a liquid, and that might be problematic. If it has to be removed with the intent that you're going to return it, right? You can't just take it off and say, I should have left it, I'll put it back on. No. Also, when you are serving it, you've got to keep one hand on it, because what it does is, as you take it off with the intention of chazara, of putting it back in, the idea is that it's all one process of taking it off, you keep holding it, then putting it on. And the final one is that the fire has to be covered. Now, the fire has to be covered really goes to the blech, a simple blech, a piece of metal that is put on top of the oven. We don't have a blech. I don't suggest it I think it's a fire hazard. A couple of years ago, there were a number of fires in America, but maybe it's because they're using gas. But there were a number of fires because things overheated and the blech overheated. You can get a Sultan hot tray. If you want to use that, get the Sultan hot tray. It's much easier as well from a halacha point of view, because the salt in hot tray, according to many, it's not considered the same as a blech. It's not a thing that is used for cooking. And part of the problem of putting things onto the blech itself is that what's called mechsi kemavashel. It looks like you're cooking. And since it looks like you're cooking, so therefore you can't do it, because people say, well, you're going to be cooking on Shabbos. So there are ways of going around it. If you're using a blech, you'd put the pot that you want to heat up on top of another pot. But if you're using a hot tray, it's much, much, much less onerous, especially if the hot tray doesn't have any adjustable knobs. If it's just a plain straight hot tray, so then, according to many, you wouldn't need to worry about covering it and all the different things that we have, because that's specifically around a blech, which is on top of the stove, which is adjustable, and it looks like it's being cooked. So any questions up till this point? I think that's quite a lot that we've spoken about so far. Okay, so that is returning. Now, one of the things that we really need to look at, I think Gaynor, you asked the question, can you reheat your spaghetti bolognese? I think it was something like that. That's where I got the topic from. I can't remember if that's what it is, but it was something along those lines. Can you reheat? Let's say it's Shabbos morning. Okay, you've got all this food that you had left over from Friday night.
Is there load shedding in Johannesburg?
It looks like there is.
Okay.
Okay. Can everyone hear me and see me? I'm in the. Okay. So what we're talking about here is now we've got some cold food that you had from the night before or whatever it was, all cooked, has to be fully cooked. Remember, if it's not fully cooked, then there's a problem. And the problem is that it's if you do put it on and it heats it up and it starts cooking it more, so then that becomes a problem of bishul properly. It's an avera d'oraisa. It's a Torah prohibition. So what we're looking at is, oh no, we just got back our lights. What we're looking at is what happens if you want to just warm your food for Shabbos, for your day meal. So let's go into that and really try and understand it. So in the old days, traditionally using a blech, what would be done is you would take the food and you put it next to the fire, the heat source that's coming up on the blech itself. Okay, or as I said, you put it on top of another pot, so that it's not exactly on the fire itself, and therefore it's done in, let's call it, an atypical manner, and therefore everybody understands you're warming it, you're not really cooking it, and you don't have to worry about it. And in addition to that, since it's all strange, you're not going to worry about turning it on. If that's the case, we now have the issue of none of us really use a blech, I would assume. You might have one of those electric blechs, those electric hot trays that you can get in Israel, but electric hot tray that you get in Israel are the same as a normal hot tray. And if that's the case, so the OU in America, they explain that it's quite simply that since we do not use a hot tray for cooking, therefore food from the fridge can be put directly onto the hot tray, and you don't have to worry about it, because it's not mechsika mavashel. It doesn't look like it's being cooked, and therefore it really would be an easy, let's call it, means of working with all of these things. Sorry, I look like I've lost. So give me one. Okay. Sorry, I lost something while through that little load shedding. If you can give me 1 minute, just want to get it back. Okay, so what we're wanting to do is we want to warm the food. We know we can use a blech. What happens if your oven is on? let's say for whatever reason you've left your oven on from the night before, because if the food is 100% cooked, then you can actually leave it in the oven. There's no issue of atmana because it's 100% cooked, so you don't have to worry about that. So you can leave it in the oven. If you've left your oven on, the question is, can you now put food into the oven to cook, to warm it up? So the answer to that, as a general rule, is that it's never permitted to return food into an oven on Shabbos, because that is clearly that looks exactly like a person is cooking, and therefore one should be careful not to do that. The biggest question I think that everybody asks is, can you warm up like a liquidy food, because the liquidy food is really, let's say, a gravy or a meat in gravy. I think maybe that was your question, Gaino. I can't remember. I think that was really what it is. Can you take whatever you've got in the oven, put it onto your even onto your hot tray to warm it up? And the answer to that really is going to depend on the nature of the food, not so much how to do it, but on the nature, because there's a machlokas amongst the Ashkenazim and the Sfardim. By the Sfardim, they say that the Sfardim say that there is no bishul after bishul, there's no cooking after cooking, even b'davar lach, even with something that is wet, meaning something that is liquidy. Whereas by the Ashkenazim, we hold that there is bishul achar bishul, there's cooking after cooking in a liquidy thing. And if that is the case, then what we do as Ashkenazim is that we do not allow the warming up of any liquid space, but rather of any liquid food, any liquidy foods, but rather we'll say anything that is liquidy can't be warmed up, but solids definitely can. How would they be warmed up? They'd be warmed up very simply. It's just simply by putting them onto this onto the hot tray in the way that one normally would do, and as long as it doesn't have the liquid, it'd be okay. I saw, interestingly, that as it's an amazing thing that as technology develops, there's a demand for how do we really deal with that. So, for example, Rav Mordechai Willig, just to understand who he is one of the Gedolim in Halacha at Yeshiva University today. He really is. Rav Hershel Shechter, we've spoken about before. It's his real Talmud, and he says the following: that you can eat up cold, fully cooked solid food on an electric hot plate, which is not used for cooking. There's only one temperature setting, no problem whatsoever. Okay, no problem whatsoever, and that is agreed to by Rav Hershel Shechter and by the Chazon Avadia, that's Rav Avadia Yosef. No problem whatsoever. And why is that? He says because if it's impossible to cook on a hot plate. Since it's impossible to cook on the hot plate, then it's no problem whatsoever. However, the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa is much stricter. And the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa says that an electric hot plate is like a covered fire, and we might not return food onto it without fulfilling other conditions of Chazorah. So at this point, we now have a machlokas, because according to this, what do you do with your hot tray? So I personally hold, as Rav Shechter, Chazon Avadia, Rav Willig, that electric hot plate as well, the Igros Moshe, that electric hot plate is electric hot plate. It is not a place to cook, and so therefore one can move. One can easily put the food there on in order to warm it up. Now, in addition to that, if you take it off, then you can put it back on, because there's no issue of chazorah. Why is it not issue of chazorah? Because it's not mexican mavashal, and it doesn't look like it's being cooked, and so therefore, since it doesn't look like being cooked, it would be okay. I think one of the other questions that definitely comes up is, can you put food on a hot plate on a timer? So what you have is you've got a hot plate. Okay, it's going to turn on in the middle of Shabbos with a timer. So can you put the cooked food on it at what place? So some people say that it's lenient to place the food in the hot plate while it's off. But many say that you shouldn't do that. For example, Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa says that one should be strict even on a Friday to put food on a hot plate that's going to turn on with a timer. But he says that really is another issue. Others say we don't have to worry about that. So we need to look at that carefully. There are many people in the world today who are very lenient and allow to put the food on a hot plate. But there are many who say that you shouldn't do it on Shabbos itself. You should only do it before Shabbos, that the hot plate will come on. But we can be lenient according to many, especially if it comes to like a tzibur, a community which is requiring. So, for example, for a brocha, you would be able to put on what do you call them, a quiche or something of that nature onto the hot tray if the hot tray is going to come on with a timer. Okay. What about a crock pot? So let's say you want I just want to go into this because I think it's a very important one that we often don't realize how important it is. And that is, let's say you've made a cholent. So you made your cholent. So I remember in yeshiva, we used to have the most amazing things. We used to go on a Friday night after we'd had supper, and then we went good learning for a few hours, and late on Friday night, we would go and we'd get cholent. So the thing is, that if you take that, you remember you have to take, if you're cooking, and if something is cooking, you have to take it off the fire in order to serve it. You're not allowed to serve it on the fire itself. Is that included is the hot tray included as the fire? That's a machlokas. I would still take it off. So you take it off the hot tray, and now you're going to serve it. Now the question is, you don't finish the cholent. You want to put it back on. That's chazor, as we spoke. Can you do it? How would you do such an issue? So there are two issues. The one is the issue of insulating. Remember, we said you can't insulate on Shabbos. Another one is the chazorah. So the advice is the following. In the crock pot itself, if you would put, according to many opinions, if you would put the pot into the crock thing, into that metal thing that warms up the pot, and you just do it normally, then what that is that itself becomes a space of hatmana, a space of insulation. It's got something on the top and it's covered on all sides. And so therefore, according to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Elyashiv and others, they say is a means of getting around that problem is by putting maybe marbles or small like balls of tinfoil at the bottom of the crock pot. If you put them at the bottom of the crock pot, it's not completely surrounded because the bottom is elevated, and therefore there is no longer an issue of hatmana. Since there's no longer an issue of hatmana, you don't have to worry about that. Now you got to worry about the chazorah. So the chazorah is, firstly, the food must be cooked properly. The heating element must be covered as well. How do you cover the heating element? So you cover the heating element, you take a piece of tinfoil, and it should cover the setting as well. There's there's adjustable setting of warm or high, low, and auto. That should be covered as well. Why is that so important? Because when it comes to cooking and when it comes to returning things onto things, we have to make sure that we're not going to turn it up. And if the setting is covered, so it's a heker, it's a way of remembering that we're not going to turn it on. Okay, so at the same time, as we said, now we've got to go back to, we said right at the beginning of the Shmir Shabbos Kilchot, that when you remove that challenge, you've got to have an intention to return it. You have to keep holding it with one hand. You've got to make sure that the food stays slightly warm. Okay, and as long as it's slightly warm, then you can return it back in. The question often comes up, just by the way, when it comes to a cholent. I just want to look at the cholent. I know we're going into a lot of different things, but there are a lot of things that just keep rolling over. The cholent issue is a big issue. Why is the cholent issue a big issue? Because most people put their cholent on just before Shabbos. Okay, you put your cholent on just before Shabbos, and it goes to cook. So number one, if we've got load shedding, then that's already a problem. Why is that already a problem? Because you haven't cooked it, and how long do you know it's going to be? It might be cooled before the electricity comes back on. And if that is the case, then there may be real issues of not having it fully cooked. Ideally, one should therefore try and cook it earlier so that it's cooked by the time that Shabbos comes in, and then you can run with that. So start a little bit early. But cooked doesn't mean completely cooked, according to many opinions. Cooked means up to what's called machal ben drusai. Machal ben drusai is like a third cooked. It's Ben Drusai was a highwayman, and he never ate completely cooked food because he was always on the run. And so therefore, since it's the third cooked, which is still edible, therefore we say it's good enough. According to many opinions, it's a leniency, and we can go. But even if there isn't load shedding, we have to be very careful. If the cholent has meat, then you can put it on immediately before Shabbos, when one should ideally cover the knobs, because one doesn't want to come to adjust them in any way. But if it's got meat in it, raw meat in it, then you can put it on just before Shabbos. But if it doesn't have raw meat in it, so then the cooking process is much shorter, because it's just a vegetarian cholent. And a vegetarian cholent you can't put on just before Shabbos, because it's almost cooked pretty quickly, and therefore there was a concern that Chazal presented that a person might come to turn up the knob in order to cook it quickly so they can actually have it on a Friday night. We know with the meat that's going to take much longer, and therefore it would only be cooked and be ready in the morning. And so therefore, when it comes to cholent, there are some specific things that that one should be aware of. Let's see what else we have. The question that came up, and I'm not going to go into all the halachas of it right now, because it's pretty complicated. But one of the things that came up is that in 2015 and in 2005, and there have been a couple lately as well, there have been a number of fires that have unfortunately killed a number of people as a result of appliances being left on Shabbos. And the question was, can you get somebody to switch them off? So ideally, no, not on a Friday night. Ideally not. You shouldn't. That's an issue of for the most part, it's an issue of what we call amir la'akum. We think that we can ask our maids to do anything that we want them to do, but we can't, because they're not allowed to do anything we're not allowed to do. So we can't just ask them unless it's for their own specific personal benefit. But most of the modern appliances that we have can somehow be attached to either a time switch or timed on the oven specifically, and that's what one should do to turn it off. Because why? Because there's a fire safety. If it's a real fire safety issue, then we can talk about that offline and have a discussion about that. So what we've seen is that there are ways in which we can warm food on Shabbos. What is the warming food that we can do? We can warm a solid food, not a liquidy food. We can do it on a hot tray, no problem. If one's got a blech, which is this piece of metal that actually covers the actual stove itself, then there are specific places and ways in putting them on the blech. I mean, my suggestion is just to get a hot tray if one is going to warm food on Shabbos, because the blech is quite complicated. And, there's it's quite complicated, and one needs to understand it properly, where you can put it, you can't put it on top of the fire, and other things of that nature. We understood the concept of chazorah, of returning things. You take them off on a Friday night off the stove, because you now want to you want to serve it, but you also want to return it. We understood one of the things got to be part of the process of taking off and putting it all back on, which means you got to have the intention, and you've got to be holding it all at the same time. And we spoke also about the importance of hatmana, and we spoke about the importance that if one is going to put food and keep things warm, or put it, one has to make sure that one doesn't create the finishing of the cooking process, because that would be an Isur D'Oraisa, a Torah prohibition. So there is a lot in the warming food on Shabbos for the daytime meal, but it can be done under certain conditions, and it should be done. If one is able to do it, one should do it. Why should one do it? Because when we have a warm meal on a Shabbos, if it's not boiling hot outside, especially I suppose in winter, Marion, perhaps this is for you. In the cold London winters, to have a warm meal is an additional aspect of Oneg Shabbos, of the enjoyment of Shabbos. It also shows us that there's also shows the halachic parameters around keeping warm, not keeping warm, and what that also does is that it highlights our ability to connect into the everyday needs of halacha when it comes to Shabbat. So let's stop there, and Bezrat Hashem will continue.